Something I started doing with shipwreck videos last year was compilation videos, taking a couple wrecks and putting them together in a mega video for those who like longer form content. I'm not at all unique in this, of course. Other channels will combine existing content like that. Well, in today's video, we'll be doing another of those compilations. This time looking at the American cruiser wrecks of Savo Island. The three lost New Orleans-class cruisers, Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes. Those three ships will always, for better or worse, be tied together. Not only are they sister ships, but they're sister ships lost at the same time, in the same place, to the same enemy. The Battle of Savo Island, the first major surface engagement of the Guadalcanal campaign, and one where the Japanese savaged the Allied forces, a force that had been split to cover multiple locations, which was a wise decision, only for it to backfire as communication broke down and exhausted crews were caught by surprise. In the end, Quincy would go down first, followed by Vincennes a few minutes later, while Astoria remained stubbornly afloat until noon the following day. Each of the ships had suffered severe damage from the Japanese fire, ranging from heavy to light shell hits, and of course, the deadly Japanese torpedo volleys. The Americans fought back, caught by surprise or not, but in the end, they did minimal damage to the Japanese, leaving Savo Island as a crushing Allied defeat and a massive Japanese victory. They only lost one cruiser, returning home, sunk by an antique S-boat. In addition to the three cruisers we'll be looking at today, the Allies also lost HMAS Canberra, though that's a more controversial sinking. Sources, especially Australians, argue that she could have been saved, instead of her ultimate fate of being scuttled. But that's a topic for another day. I won't be including Canberra in this video for a couple reasons. Length is one. That was easily my longest shipwreck video to date, and would make this video probably push 2 hours long. The second, and I'll admit more feels-based reason, is I think this works better focusing on the three sisters. Canberra's story is tied to Savo Island, and I won't deny that. But it feels like it works better focusing on the three New Orleans sisters. That's just me, however. At any rate, let's get into things, starting with Quincy. I'll be cutting out the bit about their individual sinkings, since all three are, more or less, the same story. There's differences in damage and experience, but all three were lost in the same battle. With that disclaimer out of the way, when Quincy slipped beneath the waves, the ship was lost for decades. Her wreck wouldn't be located until, as noted, the 1990s. Specifically 1992, when Robert Ballard found the hulk, at a depth of around 2,000 feet or 610 meters. Ballard found a ship with a wrecked bow, a collapsed stern, and damaged turrets. However, Quincy did retain much of her superstructure. Neither of her sisters can say the same. Unfortunately, the Nautilus survey didn't show the bridge. I'll put some of Ballard's footage here for completion's sake. All things being equal, Quincy's bridge is quite well preserved, especially in light of the fires. Still, as this video is focusing on the Nautilus survey, let's shift there now, starting of course with the weaponry. As we're already on the bow, we'll begin with a pair of bow turrets. These are the ones to show damage, and a quite distinct kind of damage at that. Both are trained to starboard, and both have damaged barrels. Something that is, admittedly, not immediately apparent looking down on turret 1. The 3 barrels are elevated, yes, but the damage isn't clear. Other than, if you're looking closely here, a shorter barrel. This was jammed, and that's left it slightly further back in the turret, and by extension, shorter than the other 2. Quincy's gunners were doing their best in a bad situation, but their gun failed them here. It seems to have jammed back after firing, leaving it shorter than the other 2. Only because part of it is further back in the turret. It's not actually shorter, even if it looks that way from closer in here, or here from a different angle. No, to actually have a shorter barrel, you need to shift to turret 2. The bow superfiring turret here. Again, from this angle, there's not much apparent damage. It's not clearly rusted out, like, say, Teruzuki, nor are there any apparent shell hits. Moving up, however, shows the shortened barrel. Quite visible, indeed, when you look here. Unlike the jammed barrel on the first turret, this one outright burst about halfway up. That's not something you see often on shipwrecks, to put it mildly, and it's very distinctive damage. Another sign of just how much Quincy's gunners tried to fight back despite their doomed situation. And coupled with the jammed barrel, a legacy to their bravery and determination, as much as it being impressive damage as well. Either way, from here, we move back to the first turret, but from the other side. There's a very notable bit of something wrapped around it here. I can't quite make it out myself. Not even from the front here. This angle does make it look wider. Maybe some split metal that fell away. I can't say for sure. As for the barrels, this shows the lack of damage to those, along with a surprising lack of silt and marine life. There's certainly coral, don't get me wrong, but the barrels are fairly clean, considering how long she's been down there. Something that applies further up as well. This one has more covering, while the jammed gun has less. It's an interesting comparison to other wrecks like Laffey, which is completely coated in coral. That said, we've reached the end of the bow turrets now. A look at the back of the turret here, though from a decent distance back. It's a nice framing shot of the entire turret, but too blurry to make out details, aside from the intact rangefinder ears at the back. Still, with nothing else to note here, let's move to the third turret, the stern turret, which is interesting in its own regard, mostly for the condition of the deck around it, admittedly, as the turret itself is broadly intact. We can see that here. It's rusty and covered in marine life, as you could expect, but there's no visible damage. Not to the turret, not to the barrels, and not to the rangefinder. Even the ladder on the side looks fine. However, when you move beyond the turret itself, interesting features start to appear. On the top back, you have the platform of the aft superstructure. As you can see on the surface here, that should be much higher up. It's fallen down to the point it's resting on the back of the turret, something that shouldn't be surprising when you look down. The entire barbette is visible at the bottom. Popping back to the surface shot, well, that shouldn't be here at all. The deck should be up to the base of the turret. Only a sliver, relatively speaking, of the barbette should be visible. This is our first look at how badly the stern collapsed, and when we move down even slightly, it's more apparent. I'm not joking when I say the entire barbette is visible. It really is, right down to the bottom. The deck isn't just collapsed, it's gone. You can even see the side of the hull here with the prop guard. That shows how much the side has also collapsed inward, not just down. We'll be returning to that later in the video. For now, let's turn back to the turret itself. When we move up on this, more of the aft superstructure is visible to the side, along with the barrels to the front. However, there's still no visible damage, not even when you move further back and look at the front of the turret. The turret face and the barrels are fine, though you can see the remnants of the canvas guard here, both the canvas itself and the framework of it. That's a first for one of these wrecks, I think. The barrels, on the other hand, are basically the same as her sisters. No damage, just a lot of coral. The front angle shot here continues that theme, with admittedly a nice look down the barrels. You can even faintly make out some of the rifling from this angle. That said, when you look from the other side of the turret, well, not much changes there. It's mostly a better look at the barbette, which again shouldn't be this visible. When you move a bit further out, more of the turret is apparent, but there's still no damage matching up with the damage plate. Only one hit was recorded to the third turret, and not in a location we've seen. So, with little else to touch on, let's wrap up the main battery here, with this nice pair of shots showing the barrels coming out of the darkness. The very shiny barrels, despite how long they've been underwater. It makes for a fitting place to end things, I think, as we shift to the lighter weaponry. Since we're on the stern, we'll start with the Chicago pianos, the quad 1.1-inch cannon mounts, which are pointing up, because the stern has collapsed in between them, just like on Vincennes. It's admittedly given a good look at the mounts here. The barrels on one with a crab hanging on, and the entire mount in the background for the other set. Something we can see better from ahead here. Both mounts are tilted up to varying degrees, with the one on the right just that bit higher up. However, tilted or not, both of them are in relatively pristine condition. The mounts and the guns are intact, with little in the way of real damage. Something much more apparent from closer in here, where the gun tub has collapsed along with the deck, but the mount is in one piece, despite the deck itself falling in here. From a bit further up, the same applies to the other mount. It's in pretty much identical shape, with both of them a fair bit more rusted out compared to, say, Hornet or Yorktown. Either way, that wraps things up here as well. So it's time to round off the weaponry with the various 5-inch guns. I won't spend long on these, simply because they're about the same as the ones on any other American wreck. The first of them here at least has the distinction of pointing straight up. I'm not sure why it is, mind you. It could be from water pressure in the sinking, for example, or the elevation mechanism rusting out. Whatever the reason, it's left the barrel pointing straight towards the surface, as you can see better here, along with a mud-covered deck and some scattered debris. The superstructure, unfortunately, is too dark to make out, though the mount is actually surprisingly well preserved, even if it is buried. The railing is intact, as is the blast shield. When we move further along, meanwhile, more of the debris is apparent. There's a lot of ruined metal between the two mounts, with the second mount covered in loose lines, which to my eye look like fishing lines. A common issue with shipwrecks, no matter the location. Lines aside, this gun is laying flat, pointing out where it might have engaged the Japanese during the battle, with a higher angle shot showing even more line behind it clustered here. And yet more of that fishing line is apparent on the other side of the wreck, where we have one of the other guns pointing towards the amidships deck with a lot of line ahead of the barrel, along with what looks like a pair of small shell holes punched into the blast shield. That tangled fishing line is more visible from a bit further up, along with some of the ship's wiring here and the barrel barely in frame. That fishing line is why Nautilus didn't do a direct over-the-top flyby. Far too much risk of getting tangled up in the lines. The death knell of any ROV. Still, while we may not have a good top look, we do have good side looks, such as this one of another 5-inch gun. Another one pointing in, giving us an excellent look at the breach, or at least as much as we can see beyond the rust and silt. This weapon hasn't fared nearly as well as the turrets, and much of it is unrecognizable, aside from the railing here and the ready ammunition stowage here. Now for the last 5-inch gun. This one is also pointing up, where it's become completely entangled in fishing line, from the tip of the barrel down to the mount itself. Quincy is a hazardous wreck for an ROV survey, as you can tell. Likely why there wasn't any focus on the bridge tower this time around. Regardless, let's move to the aft superstructure now, and from there to the hull. The first and most notable part of that superstructure is this bit here, one of the two bases for the catapults. We saw the same structure on her sisters, of course, but on Quincy, well, just look. This one shows more of the collapsed deck from the angle it's resting at. A sharp angle. Admittedly, the catapult base and the hull side show little in the way of damage. There's an intact ladder here, and the side shows very little, rust aside. Even the rivets are still visible, something that continues as you move up the base, though the catapult itself is, of course, missing. That is also common between the sister ships. Less common, on the other hand, is this bit of structure here. It's intact, or at least mostly so, but it's also only a brief glimpse in shadow. This is actually the reason I suspect that Quincy hasn't gotten a dedicated Nautilus video. It's difficult to put one together with what they were able to work around. That fishing line really made it a lot more difficult than it already is diving on such a deep wreck. In any case, a bit further along, we come to that tangled fishing line on the 5-inch gun. That stretches into the background where it's wrapped around what I believe to be the aft tower, or what's left of it at any rate. From this angle, it's just too dark to make out anything, other than where that line stretches up towards the surface here, and from closer in here, some more of the tower, along with what seems to be some of the funnel liner. Or at least that's what Nautilus identified the shiny metal as on Vincennes. Whereas here, we return to that bit of superstructure from before. We still can't see it very well, though I believe this is where the second funnel would have been. You can see the area here on the surface. This cutaway in the side in particular is distinctive, even if it has collapsed on the bottom. The funnel itself is, of course, long gone. The same can be said for the rest of the structure around it. Very little remains at this point, though we do get a good look from close in, even if it mostly serves to show how much is rusted. Further along, meanwhile, we have the catapult base again, though there's not exactly much difference from the other pictures, aside from being more real color with less of the deep water blue tint. There are a couple holes in it that we can see now, one here by the ladder, and one on the bottom here. Both seem to be rust damage to my eye. They don't look like shell holes. That aside, we can wrap up the superstructure now by looking to the aft tower. From afar, there's not much to note. We can see the overall shape, with some busted metal towards the bottom. Metal we see better here, including where the hanger has been almost peeled back. And from a bit further down, we have the base of the tower, where you can see how it's falling down towards the stern, especially here where it's resting against the back of the third turret, with this doorway down here showing how far down it's fallen, while the battle damage is more apparent here. The metal is twisted and broken, and the platform is collapsing here, while the tower itself is starting to rust through further back, as you can see in more detail here. Despite this, some details are still there, like the cabling here or the doorway beside it, even if the base of the fire control equipment is shattered, with the rangefinder in particular completely gone here, right above where the platform is resting on the number 3 turret. We see that area from above here, the platform, the rangefinder base, and a 20mm gun. All 3 are rough, as you could expect, but at the same time, well, they're arguably better than the hangar area. We see that here, where the metal is gone. Moving up the tower shows a devastated side, with much of the superstructure burnt and rusted out. This shot in particular is scary for how much of it is bowed in here. The area above isn't terrible by comparison, which can't be said for the actual hangar, which is shattered. There's nothing left. The fires here would have been particularly bad, and that's led to much of the structure rusting away, where it wasn't plain burnt away. However, that wraps up the superstructure, with 3 more pictures here. First, this one of some sort of debris resting on the deck. It looks like it might be what's left of the funnel, but I can't be sure. While this picture, for its part, has the catapult resting on the deck, along with a hose here, likely part of the effort to fight the fires, though those failed to save the ship. The last picture, meanwhile, is the other catapult base, one that's more upright, but otherwise much the same. Now, with that sorted, let's round off this lengthier than expected video with the stern. Here, by the hangar, we see the start of the collapse, along with the remnants of her paint scheme. As we move further aft, the damage is even more apparent. The stern has bowed in, with the prop guard almost vertical, while the prop itself is buried in the mud. From above, the bowed-in deck is easier to see. Quincy's stern deck is basically gone, at least here. Even here, the side of the hull is falling inward. It's not quite as bad further back towards the Chicago pianos. Bad, certainly, but at least the deck is still recognizable. Even if, when you reach the extreme stern, things get bad again. Here, the stern shows implosion damage, something that all 3 of the American cruisers show. It's an interesting feature that matches up across the ships. Though, unsurprisingly, Quincy is the worst off here. The aft of the ship has been punched in pretty comprehensively, especially towards the bottom, while above that, the rust is so severe that there's no sign of her name, just rusted metal and coral. And if you thought the other side was any better, it really isn't. If anything, it's crumpled in more over here. If you wanted to see what implosion damage looked like on a cruiser, well, here it is. It's not pretty how the steel has crumpled and buckled. It's worse here, but this area isn't much better with that jagged pattern. Even the rudder here is crumpled in. Something like what you saw on Scorpion, actually, showing this is certainly implosion damage. That said, we've reached the end of the video. I'll round things off here with one of the props. We have the shaft here, which isn't buried on this side, covered in rust but not buried. On the other hand, the blades show clear damage here and here, likely a result of the other one breaking away, leaving just the empty prop shaft to the side. It seemed like a fitting image to end on. Another sign of the damage Quincy took, even if a less obvious kind in this case. Less obvious damage, perhaps, but still damage either way. Her sisters would continue to show more obvious signs of what sent them to the bottom. Vincennes, for example, is absolutely peppered with shell holes, including one very distinctive one to the stern. A stern that has some interesting damage all its own, in particular the aft superstructure. Vincennes is probably the middle child of these wrecks. Quincy was found first and is the best known. Astoria, well, you'll see on her. But Vincennes, she doesn't have the same kind of distinctive damage. Even so, she's an interesting look, I think, as we get into that now. She wouldn't be located by Robert Ballard's 1990s surveys, unlike Quincy. Instead, Vincennes would have to wait for 2015 when Paul Allen's team surveyed Iron Bottom Sound. The wreck they found was in rough but recognizable shape. The bow was gone and much of the bridge had fallen away. And of course, the stern was collapsed, as I noted earlier. Despite this, all the turrets remained in place, and the hull, bow aside, was in more or less one piece. In the intervening decade, not a lot has changed on the wreck. When Nautilus returned in July 2025, they found a wreck in more or less the same condition. There's not a lot of extra deterioration compared to the previous look. Her relatively deep depth, around a kilometer down, likely helps there. In any event, where I can, I'll make direct comparisons between the two surveys. One area I can't do this, however, is the bridge, so I'll put the octopus shot here just for completion's sake. This fell away from the rest of the wreck and landed in the mud. We can't see much here other than the overall structure and some bridge windows. It's an interesting look, but since it's the only look, let's move on to the Nautilus survey. As with the Udachi video last weekend, I'll do this in stages, starting with the weaponry, then the remaining superstructure, bridge aside of course, and then the hull. With all that sorted, let's begin with the forward main battery turrets. Vincennes carried 3 triple 8-inch gun turrets, 2 on the bow and 1 on the stern. We got a good look at all of these in both surveys, and it's here where we return to that picture from earlier, where I can point out the differences if you didn't spot them before. First, we have the view from Octopus in 2015. We only really see the number 1 turret in any detail, and even then, mostly the barrels and a little bit of the turret face. The number 2 turret is out of frame. Still, there is one thing I want to focus on, that being the debris. There's some here on top of the turret, covering up much of the turret face and the roof. And there's more here where the bow broke. Between the two, you can't see the front of the turret very well, though the barrels are intact and poking out. Now let's move forward a decade to the Nautilus survey. We don't have an exact one-to-one replication of the octopus picture, but this one is pretty close. And I think you'll quickly note that the debris is gone. Instead of being practically buried in broken steel, the turret is mostly clean. The barrels haven't really changed much by comparison, but that's not as noteworthy. The missing debris is. In both cases, it's the single biggest difference for a decade worth of deterioration. Beyond this, as we move forward, you won't see much change at all. It's a striking difference when compared to how much Udachi fell apart. Though, before we move on, a quick note. I'm sure at least someone will comment that this is evidence of illegal salvage or the like. It isn't. Not only is this wreck too deep to easily reach, if she were being torn apart, suffice it to say there would be a lot more evidence than some missing debris. With that detour aside, let's look a bit down on the turret. This shows two things: the continued missing debris and the bow break. Neither of those or the turret itself are very clear. It's too dark and out of focus, but it is a good preview of later looks, such as here where more of the break is visible. It does look like the debris has fallen down over the years, but I can't say with 100% certainty that's the same stuff from 2015. As for the number 1 turret itself, there's not much in the way of notable damage, neither from below or above. It's mostly intact, with the barrels elevated up. It's hard to say why, due to the chaos of that battle, though you see a similar elevation on Quincy's wreck, so it's not at all unique here. The only damage I can pick out is a missing rangefinder ear. It's too faint to tell for sure beyond that, though there might be shell damage. That would match up with hit number 5 on the damage plate. On the other hand, the second turret's barrels are flat. You can faintly see them here, but in the next couple images, we'll look at that turret closer. Very close, in fact, with this one. Again, the turret itself is intact, from the barbette to the turret itself, and even the deck around it has preserved wood, though we do see our first shell hole here. It's a fairly small impact all told, but it did punch clean through the armor. Meanwhile, the barrels are, as noted, fine, flat and hanging out over the number 1 turret, with no signs of visible damage to them. That said, when looked at from this angle, we can see how the first turret is trained out very slightly, which is why the images from head-on look a bit crooked. And on the topic of the first turret, we see the structure better here. No shell holes, no major rusting. For all intents and purposes, it's in one piece from this side. All the more impressive considering the bow breaking off right in front of it. The second turret, for its part, does have more visible rusting. The back is pretty overgrown, and the rangefinder ears are full of silt and rusticles. And when you move to the starboard side, you can see more damage. The rust is much more apparent for one, and there's shell impacts to the side here. Impacts, but not penetrations. We see those a bit better here. This one in particular is rather large, though the rangefinder ear and a ladder are both still there. On the other side of the turret, however, there's a visible shell penetration. We can see a hit in that area on the damage plate, and more importantly, it's an area we saw in 2015. Here we got a nice and close-in look. Again, there's not really an equivalent shot from Nautilus, but this one from further out works. Not much has changed. It hasn't notably rusted out, and looks almost identical. It's also where we start to wrap up the bow turrets. The rest of the images are different angles on what we saw before, such as the turret face of turret 2 here, or the starboard side of turret 1 still showing no visible shell impacts, while the barrels just show a better look at their elevation, or from further down the lack of debris compared to 2015, with the final look at the number 1 turret mostly being interesting for, well, a crab, in the same position as the octopus survey. I just found that a bit amusing and a nice break from the sobering look at what is a gravesite. The last look at the bow turrets, meanwhile, is of the roof of turret 2, where the faint remnants of a paint stripe are still visible. With that covered, it's time to move back to turret 3. This one is interesting. Vincennes' entire aft superstructure was wrenched out and fell on top of it. The damage plate shows multiple hits to that structure, so I'm not terribly surprised by this. Nonetheless, it's buried the stern turret. Even from closer in, you still can't see all of it. That's true here in 2025, and it was equally true in 2015. Though, interestingly, not much has actually changed. Even the rusticles on the tips of the barrels are the same. Maybe a bit bigger, but not by much. That said, we do see things a bit better now, such as here, where the turret face is completely covered at the top. We'll be returning to the aft superstructure later, however, so let's move down, to where, much like Quincy, the entire stern barbette is exposed. Most of that should be buried beneath the deck. So this is our first glimpse of how badly that's collapsed, though the turret itself is in one piece. Even closer in, there's no apparent damage here, aside from the deck damage. The turret roof is, in the same vein, mostly fine, though we see more debris here, including this shiny bit that Nautilus identified as funnel liner, while the back of the turret is similarly in one piece. It's also our last good look at the stern turret because the rest is completely buried. Either way, let's move on to the lighter weaponry, starting with the 5-inch secondaries. I won't spend as long on this because there's less unique details. For better or worse, these look about the same as any 5-inch single mounting on an American shipwreck, covered in silt and rusticles with the shape of the weapon clearly visible, along with the wrecked remains of the mount itself. There aren't many details to pick out. Not on the mount, not on the gun shield, and not on the deck in the background. Though it does seem to have ready ammunition storage, if I'm not mistaken, here. But that's about it. Although we do see this exact mount in the 2015 survey, where very little, if anything, has changed in the intervening decade. There's not much notable increase in rust, silt, or marine growth. It's practically identical again. The other gun photographed in 2015, for its part, doesn't have as close a look in 2025. I believe it's this one, but I can't say for sure. While the other 5-inch guns are all in basically the same shape as the first one, just in different orientations, with the more distinct bits coming in the background, such as here where we have a lot of torn cabling. This was the searchlight platform, and those cables likely relate to that. Beyond this, there's not much to note for the secondary battery, though at least this one is pointing out. The last two are both pointing inward, though I couldn't begin to tell you why. This one is slightly elevated, while this one is completely flat. They might have been twisted around during the sinking, but I can't say for sure. The 20mm guns, meanwhile, have even less to touch on. We don't get a good close-in look at those. They're covered in rusticles, and that's about the most I can say. These are at the base of the bridge tower, and we see them in 2015 as well, though not this one alone on the deck. However, that's about it, so let's wrap up this section on the stern, where we have two very inclined Chicago piano mounts. The quad 1.1-inch cannon, where the deck collapsed beneath them. We don't see these in 2015, though there was a similar mount from the bridge here. As for the stern pair, they're mostly intact, just angled straight up due to the deck not being in one piece. It's a very striking look, to say the least. You rarely see something like this, where a collapsed deck has led to weapons pointing straight up. although it did give a great look at the top of this mount, where you have a mix of rusted out mount and shiny steel parts, the magazine wells and the barrels themselves, both of which are remarkably clean, all things being equal. That applies to both mounts, by the way, as you can see from the side here, which also wraps up this fairly lengthy look at the weaponry. Now for the superstructure, such as it is. We'll start here on the bridge area. There's not much to note really. We have the frames that supported a 5-inch gun mount. Not much beyond this, aside from a couple shell impacts here and here. The reason I picked this shot is because it's the closest we have to this look from Octopus. Not identical, no, but the best comparison we have. Meanwhile, a bit further along, we have 3 more shell impacts. 1 to the side and 2 to the deck. One of which tore a chunk out of the deck on the way to hit the superstructure. As we continue further back, we return to the 5-inch guns, and more specifically, the area behind them. First, the searchlight platform, which looks like it received a shell hit here, while just ahead of there, we have the hole where the forward funnel would have been located. It's completely gone, leaving a gaping void into the ship. The same applies to the aft funnel here, though we do get a better look inside at least. And nearby, we also have the base of a catapult. This is mostly intact, though the catapult itself fell away. You can see it in 2015 here. That said, on the back side, we do have some notable bending where the ladder is. And we also see an entrance next to a spare anchor. That anchor has remained in place, still lashed to the side, where it was also photographed back in 2015. The main difference here is some more debris by the entrance, including the remnants of its door. The deck is still intact though, wood and all. Which cannot be said for the aft superstructure. You can clearly see where it was torn away here, leaving a gaping gash in the deck. That structure is crumpled in and collapsed over the aft turret as established earlier. But looking at it in more detail, well, when I say crumpled in, I do very much mean it. Basically nothing is recognizable, at least until you reach the upper levels, where some portholes and walkways become apparent. But even then, there's not much to say. It's all busted up by the collapse and the Japanese shell fire. Even the top has more of that apparent funnel liner stretched over it. Despite that damage, however, there is one 20mm gun here, hanging on for dear life as the rest of the structure collapsed around it, while the starboard side does have some more recognizable parts, in the sense that it isn't crumpled metal at least. Even so, it's still not that much better. So let's leave the superstructure here and move to the hull to wrap up this lengthy video. We'll start with the bow, or at least what's left of it. This was torn off in the sinking, and it shows. The area on the main hull is a mess of twisted metal, from far out or from closer in. There's not much recognizable. While up by the turret, we have bent steel pressed up against it. This debris here might be what we saw in 2015. It's tough to say without a better look from that older survey, but it's certainly possible. Regardless, when we move further down, you return to, how is this intact at all? Everything is torn up from what seems to be a pretty violent breakup. This is nothing like the splits on Wasp, which were quite clean. This is a much more typical broken bow with all that implies. On both sides, actually, as the port side of the break shows here, even if some of the metal at the front of the turret is more bent rather than torn. Meanwhile, as we move along the port side, we see a lot of shell holes. The ship was peppered by Japanese shell fire, and a lot of those shell holes are still visible, some more rusted than others. And these aren't just in the side either. They extend further up towards the gun tubs for the 5-inch guns as well. Basically, no part of Vincennes was spared shell fire. Despite this, the most notable damage isn't the bow or the shells. It's the stern, where we see the crumpled in part here by the stern turret. Not only has it fallen inward, there's a very clear crack in the side by the prop guard. A crack that extends down to the prop itself. I'm honestly surprised the stern didn't break off too, looking at how far this goes. The prop, meanwhile, was also photographed in 2015. The main difference in the past decade is that it got buried deeper in the mud. Not much else has changed that we can see. Moving beyond here, we'll wrap up this video on the stern, where the entire structure has crumpled in, both the deck and the stern bottom. This implosion-looking damage is a common theme on all three American cruisers, as we'll see with Astoria and Quincy. Vincennes, meanwhile, has some very rough damage here. It's bent and buckled badly, and yet, despite this, the most famous damage to the wreck is still to come. That being this, the massive shell hole in the stern. Another aspect we saw in 2015, and another area where very little has changed. Even the remnants of the paint are the same. It seems a good point to end this lengthy look at USS Vincennes, if you ask me. Her most distinctive feature between the two surveys. That shell hole is, as I said, the most distinctive thing on Vincennes' wreck. None of the other wrecks we've looked at have a shell impact quite like it. Shell holes, yes, but not one on the very tip of the stern, and one that has survived more or less unchanged since the sinking, or at least the decade between the surveys. Astoria hasn't changed much either in that regard, with her most distinctive feature coming from her bow. As we've seen, that breaking off isn't surprising. Leaving those three wrecks aside for the moment, it's a meme for American warships, cruisers, and destroyers to lose their bows. However, Astoria's bow had to be different. It didn't fall away. Not entirely. Well, let's get into things, and you'll see what I mean about that one. Astoria would have to wait a couple more decades, with her wreck found in 2015 by Paul Allen's team on Octopus, at a depth of 860 meters or 2,820 feet. Relatively shallow by Pacific War standards, but still plenty deep. And unlike the similarly shallow Udachi, Astoria's wreck has fared fairly well. In 2015, the wreck was quite well preserved, aside from the missing bow. And in July 2025, when Nautilus returned to the wreck, that was still true. Much like Vincennes, Astoria shows very little deterioration from the intervening decade, with one notable exception. And just like the video last weekend, I'll do comparisons where I can. I find it interesting to see the differences, or as the case may be, the lack of differences. Regardless, we'll start with the weaponry once again. Then it'll be the superstructure, such as it is, and we'll finish with the hull. I can hear the questions about the bow, however. Well, that will be in the weaponry section, simply by virtue of where it landed. Though we also have the sonar from 2015 here, where the bow is quite apparent. Now let's start the weaponry, moving from bow to stern. Since Astoria is Vincennes' sister, a lot of this is going to be similar. The overall shape and condition of the turrets, for example. Where things differ is in the orientation. Astoria's number 1 turret is trained far out to port, as you can see here. About as far as it can go, actually. The number 2 turret is out of frame, but you do get a glimpse at a common feature on this wreck, the anchor chain here. That got dragged right along with the bow and is draped over the entire ship. We saw it more in 2015, but it's quite visible here as well. As for the turret, there's not much in the way of damage here. Not from far out, and not from close in. The rusting is relatively minimal, and there's no shell holes here. The barrels are also intact, unlike the damaged equivalent on Quincy. We also see more of that chain and the number 2 turret's barrels. However, as we move further down the turret, things don't look quite as good. The turret itself is largely fine. There's some interesting discoloration here. I'm not sure what caused that, but it's quite apparent. As is the damage to the barbette here. The ring had a chunk taken out of it, where the deck also collapsed. That damage, just beneath the turret face, would match up with 2 hits on the damage plate. Hits 3 and 4, both by 8-inch guns. Hit 5, meanwhile, isn't apparent on any of the survey images. That aside, let's move on. We get another angle on the barbette here, although the more notable thing is definitely the deck collapse. We see this much better in the next picture. The downward angle is pretty clear, as is the anchor chain snaking up and over the rear of the turret. The turret itself is mostly fine. No shell hits, with the ladder and rangefinder ear both intact. And both are more visible in the next picture, along with that weird discoloration. Beyond this, we start to move further forward, such as here towards the very front of the turret. The barrels covered in coral, but otherwise all right, and all flat and level as well. Anyway, we can see more of the chain again, stretching between the 2 turrets. It's just as apparent in the next picture from directly in front of the turret, which is, admittedly, a nice look down the barrels. And the next picture is a nice look down at the barrels. Not to mention our first good look at the number 2 turret beyond the shadowy background shots. Again, all the barrels are fine, despite that chain wrapped up and over them. Here, at least, the bow did no damage as it fell away, not even when you move further down. Though we do have what looks like a shell hit here that isn't on the damage plate. It could just be rusted metal, but to my eye, it looks much more like a hit. Either way, these last couple images are a good point to bring in the first octopus picture. We don't really have a good direct comparison, but these are close enough. And unsurprisingly, there's not much difference in the wreck. Everything seems to be about the same. In any case, as we move on, we move back to a view at the top of the number 1 turret. Not much to note here, other than the lack of any damage or paint. The more interesting look comes here from further down, where we see the chain draped over the back of the turret, though the coral does make it harder to pick out. It's, surprisingly enough, easier to make out from further out. It sticks out a bit more, though it helps that you can see the base of it here, and when you move a bit further along, you can see it even better. This isn't chain that fell out of the chain locker like presumably happened on Maya. Here, it's the chain from the deck. Okay, it still comes from the chain locker, just not because that broke open this time. That aside, we'll wrap up the bow turrets here, with some shots from further out. Here we have the number 1 turret still showing no major damage, either to the turret or the barrels, and that applies to both sides of the turret as well. Although on the starboard side, the break in the hull is more apparent, along with the chain stretched over the rangefinder ear and the turret side. That said, we finished here. Now for the stern turret, and paradoxically the bow. Here we have the first look at the number 3 turret. Much like the bow pair, the barrels looming out of the darkness. Not exactly the most detailed look, but I felt it was a fitting image to start with. Plus, you can see some details on the deck, like what seems to be a jammed open hatch here. Meanwhile, as we move further along, we see the turret itself. Just like the other two, there's not much in the way of visible damage. A look at the damage plate shows very few hits to Astoria's stern, and only 2 to the barbette of the stern turret. That's left the upper part completely intact. And as you can see here, mostly clear of debris. Unlike Vincennes, this turret isn't buried. The only debris I can pick out is a bit of metal here, and of course the chain further back. We see both of those much better in this picture, along with the bow to the side. As you can see in this image from Octopus, not much has actually changed. In 2015, the bow was pressed up to the rangefinder ear with the chain draped over it. The biggest change that I can pick out, at least from this angle, is that the bow has fallen down. In 2015, it was well above the chain. In 2025, it's fallen down on top of it. Most likely the deck collapsing beneath it after holding up the weight of the bow for 83 years. I'm impressed it's held up that long, honestly, and it's a testament to Astoria's builders. Anyway, as we move back to the stern turret, we get a closer look from the side. It's a bit blurry due to the distance it was taken from, but we can see the chain better as well as the tip of the bow, which has definitely fallen down. It's not pressed up to the turret like it used to be. You can see this a bit better here, along with the shape of the turret itself. As for the next couple pictures, they move up and over the turret to look at the back. More of that chain is visible as a result, along with some interesting details, like the rivets holding the rangefinder on here, or of course, the blurry bow to the back, which is much more apparent here, something that also shows how the chain comes up from underneath the bow, not over it. An interesting detail considering how it's draped over everything else. And as we move further on, another interesting detail shows up. The deck next to the third turret. Remember, this is completely caved in on both Quincy and Vincennes to varying degrees. On Astoria, it's fine. The stern hasn't really collapsed at all. Considering the damage to the rest of her hull, that is impressive. However, we've reached the end of the third turret. This image shows a good look at the top and the side, while this one gives us a good framing shot of the barrels, though both of them don't show much new aside from this bit of debris here. Closer inspection makes that look like a powder case. It's a bit shinier and is the right shape, but without a better look, I can't say that for 100% certain. So, with that in mind, let's shift to the bow, the detached part, not the main hull. First, we have the anchor here. This has remained firmly in place both in the sinking and the decades since, despite, as you can faintly see here, a pretty nasty break just behind it. We see this better from the side here. Just a couple feet further, and the anchor would have been lost too. And I don't say that lightly when you move just a little further along. Here, the bow vanishes. We didn't really get a good look at this from Octopus, unfortunately, so I can't say how bad it was in 2015. The closest we get is this from further down, which does give a hint of the damage here. So, in the lack of contradictory evidence, I'd say this damage comes from the initial break. As for that damage, there's not really much to say. The bow is torn and twisted, with some particularly shiny metal here, and a bunch of debris towards the bottom. We see that debris better here, along with a porthole on the shinier metal. And for that matter, more of the side of the bow stretching into the darkness, both in this image and in this one here. It's safe to say more of the bottom of the bow came along than the top, which you can see where it comes to an end here, caving in Astoria's deck and wiping out a gun tub. Now, to wrap up the bow, we'll return to the deck. Here's the tip, further fallen down next to the stern turret, but otherwise intact and recognizable in its shape, while the last two images show evidence for my theory that the deck is collapsing, not the bow itself. You can see an angle on Astoria's side here, with the bow sinking in. It's not quite as apparent from above here, but when you turn back to the 2015 image, well, the deck wasn't that bad. Slightly caved in here, but not to the same extent. Though without a better look at it, my theory remains a theory. So, let's wrap up the weaponry, starting with the 5-inch guns. We have one here, pointing straight up. There's two reasons I started with this one. First, the excellent look at the mount and its inner workings, including the elevation gear here. And second, for the caved-in deck behind it. That's going to be a recurring theme here. And when you look at the next image, it's all the more apparent. This mount is tilted widely over, like the stern Chicago pianos on Vincennes or Quincy. Now, this isn't to say that all of them are this bad. This one, for instance, is pretty flat, though the gun tub has fallen down a bit. There's debris behind it, though it's not clear. But the mount itself, that's about as good as you could expect it to be. On the other hand, when we return to the first one, well, there's a ton of scattered debris here. The remnants of the funnels and the other superstructure. I couldn't begin to pick out specific details in that twisted mess. Something that continues as we move along to this mount. The deck around it is almost entirely gone, leaving just the mount's base left. Give it some more time, and this will fall clean through, which has already happened to this one. It's also angled up, but you can tell it's a different one because of the deck. That's completely collapsed, leaving the mount precariously balanced on its base. It's severe damage, to say the least. Despite this, however, the gun tub is still mostly there, even if everything behind it isn't. This damage, and similar damage across the amidships section, is severe. As Astoria went under, the ship was still burning fiercely below decks. That likely weakened things and contributed to this collapse. Alternatively, the bow tore things up on the way to its resting place. That's almost certainly what happened to the aft superstructure. But with the relative lack of damage on the bow, I can't say for sure that's what happened here. In any event, when we turn to the front of the gun tubs, the damage isn't as apparent. The debris, yes, but not the damage. You can almost forget just how bad it is in favor of, well, these look about the same as any other American wreck. Something that was also the case with this one back in 2015. The gun mount and its surroundings were pretty fine as these things go. Although, as this one shows, even from the side, the damage is apparent in places. Namely how bad the collapse to the center is, as well as some broken steel here. While this one here is covered in crumpled debris. If I had to guess, bits of the bridge tower and the forward funnel. But I can't be certain. The next one, for its part, isn't as bad. The deck is collapsing, yes, but the mount is fine. And the same goes for its gun tub, as is also the case for this one, though there is more damage to the deck here. It's also the final 5-inch gun, so we can finish things off with the Chicago pianos on the stern. The quad 1.1-inch cannon mount to be more formal. This is another area where very little has changed. The mount is still broadly intact and recognizable, and in basically the same condition as it was back when Octopus took a look a decade ago. Right down to the coral, the rust patterns, and the hose stretched over the top. We don't see the other one as well, but it seems to be in similar shape, and the deck between both of them, debris aside, is in one piece as well. It's certainly better than the equivalent area on her sisters. Either way, that wraps up the weaponry. Longer than usual, but that's because of the bridge being included. And it would have been longer had Nautilus filmed any of the 20mm guns. They did not, so here's the octopus images for completion's sake. Now to finish this video off with the superstructure and hull. First, we have the catapult base here, with a very clear shell hole at the bottom. The rest of it, on the other hand, is more intact. There's very little damage beyond the rusting. And of course, the missing catapult. We actually see that, but not where you'd expect. You see, not only did Astoria's bow fall on her stern deck, her stern fell on top of her catapult as well. It's here, and that's a first to my knowledge. I've never seen another wreck do something like this. Unfortunately, as we move on from here, things do get less recognizable. I won't linger long on any of these pictures because there's not much to say. It's a sea of broken wood and collapsed steel. Every part of Astoria's deck, from the catapults forward, is busted in. It only varies in degrees of severity, and none of these images are particularly pretty as a result. The same goes for the debris that fell to the side here. I can't pick out any sort of details on what this used to be. It's all too badly torn up to make that out. From the front all the way to the back here. On the other hand, this curved bit here seems to have a porthole. That still doesn't really say where it came from, but it's an interesting note. That aside, as we look further ahead, I think this might be from the bridge. Not because of these pictures, but because of this one. That's part of her mast, as you can see here when we move further up from the seabed. Right up to here, the base for a rangefinder. How this ended up off the side of the ship isn't clear, though it might again be from the bow. If that took out the bridge on the way to the stern, well, it explained things. As well as the bit here where things have collapsed inward, or here behind the number 2 turret where the deck just ends. A dark void where everything collapsed. A collapse that applies further forward where the bow broke as well. It's about as rough as you'd expect for how badly the bow tore away. Nothing but broken steel falling toward the bottom, either from afar or from closer in. That said, let's end this lengthy video on the stern, where we have some debris off to the side here, near where the catapult pokes out beneath the prop guard, while the stern itself is fine. There's a shell hole here, but despite this, the name Astoria is still legible, mostly. And further up, the deck is in one piece with little apparent damage. It makes a striking comparison to her sister ship when you look at the final image here. But that's Astoria in a nutshell, both like and unlike her sisters. In the end, as I said, these 3 wrecks have some interesting similarities. Of course, they're sister ships, and they sank at the same time and in the same manner. Yet, even so, it's interesting to pick out where some things are common to them. The imploded stern, the collapsed hull, the shell impacts, and of course the missing bows, even if Astoria stands out for her bow landing on the stern thing. It's why I felt they worked for the first compilation of the year. Nowhere in any other warship grave do you get sister ships quite like this. And I think that makes for an interesting look at those wrecks. One that deserved to be put together like this for those who like the longer form content. I'll likely do other compilations of the Iron Bottom wrecks as well. Maybe the destroyers will be next. Or, more likely, a split between the American and Japanese destroyers. Thoughts for later, I suppose. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.